Hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and welcome to Perspectives Matter. This program is part 2 of a part series called Do Authoritarians Rule the World? Joining us, one first from Mexico City, is Roberto Salinas. He is the president of the Mexico Business Forum. He is also the president of the Alamos Alliance, director for the Center for Latin America at the Atlas Network. And he's an expert on trade, monetary issues, and economic other issues as well. So, Roberto, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Dennis. Great to be back.
And sitting next to you, of course, is Barbara Kolm. She's vice president of the Austrian Central Bank. She's director of the Austrian Economic Center. She is president of the Hayek Institute and professor of economics at the University of Donja Gorica in Montenegro. Barbara, welcome back to the program as well. And give that viewer just a short bit of what we talked about in part 1.
Well, thank you, Dennis, for having me back. And it's good to be here and discussing autocrats and totalitarianism with you and with Roberto, and making a difference, also a historical one, because this is a big deal. We've seen autocrats, we have seen people rise to power who just power greedy and are reckless in what they want to do and what they want to achieve, and and they want to stay in power as long as possible. And this is what we have been discussing earlier, and also the consequences of the individuals, which is very bad, because there is no such thing as choice then. If you are in such a regime, you are not able to choose, you're not able to be as free as you are usually when it's a democratically elected and continued democracy, where the rule of law is in place, where there are checks and balances, and where the individuals have their rights as well as entrepreneurs. And this is where we stand these days, or where we're with our discussion, both in Latin America and in Europe.
Okay, Roberto.
Well, I think Barbara summed it up very nicely. First of all, there is a tidal wave of what you could call illiberal populism, which has led to the emergence of autocrats of all stripes, left, right, center, up, down, whatever. It's not about ideology. It's about keeping power. We have examples in Mexico. We have examples in Nicaragua, of course, Cuba and Venezuela that are the famous ones, but also Argentina. Even Chile has had its own stint with authoritarianism. Like Barbara was saying, the most important negative consequence of this is that it undermines the freedom to choose of citizens, of regular men and women that are simply trying to get ahead. And that's what we have to keep in mind when we think about autocracy and when we think about how authoritarianism undermines freedom of choice and the institutions of liberal democracy.
Okay, well put, both of you. And let's focus just a minute on Argentina, since we didn't really talk about that in the first segment. And Roberto, you don't know this, but I went to Argentina in 1996 to speak at 3 different places, and the bunch of chief financial officers of multinational companies talked about strategic planning. But most importantly, they wanted me to tell them why they were paying, in some cases, 400 basis points more on their government debt than other countries in Latin America. And I reminded them what happened in the early 80s with the crazy stuff they've had. And Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world after the Second World War. What happened and what continues to happen in Argentina?
Well, Dennis, that is a good example precisely of what happens when a highly populist and highly illiberal stripe of authoritarianism comes into power. And in the interest of keeping clienteles, it doesn't matter what the consequences are for the economy. Let's print more money and let's print as much money so the government can spend as much and give to specific clienteles that will keep me in power. And that's Peronismo. That's the legacy of Evita Perón and of Juan Domingo Perón that today is embodied in the figure of Cristina Kirchner. She's taken it to the next level, so to speak. So what do you have? You have a country like Argentina that has tremendous human capital, tremendous natural resources, an absolutely wonderful country. Of course, they won the World Cup. And then, like Axel Kaiser said, what Argentina needs is a World Cup of economic and political policymakers to be able to take Argentina to what it should be today, one of the richest and most prosperous countries in the entire world. Today, Dennis, 1996, the exchange rate was 1-to-1. Domingo Cavallo had just introduced the convertibility law and the 1-to-1, 1 peso, $1. Today is 390 pesos per dollar. Again, and it's depreciating at an incredibly fast rate because inflation, Barbara will tell you better than anybody, is 100%. 100% is a matter of days of when to go to the supermarket and when to be able to finance this. So 400 basis points is probably modest in comparison today to what you would have to pay, because there's no credit. Credit comes from credere, credibility. If your unit of account has no credibility in sustaining purchasing power and stability, there's absolutely no place to go. So what do Argentinians do? They go the informal route. And things seem to work, but they work despite government and despite Kirchnerismo.
Yeah, and that's a real shame. I don't think they listen to me. I hope they listen to you. Barbara, when we talked recently, I didn't know that you were actually working for the central bank in Austria. We've had, shall we say, a few challenges with the Federal Reserve System here in the U.S. and inflation and its impact on Europe and all other places. Give us some sense of that, and then tie in sort of the Ukrainian-Russian situation for us in terms of authoritarianism.
Well, first of all, I'm on the board of the central bank, which is I oversee it, which is different. We oversee the management of the central bank, but we are also involved because Austria has a special law on that. We are also involved in day-to-day management. But of course, the Austrian central bank cannot raise interest rates, for example, per se. We are involved as you mentioned, in the European central bank system because we hold the euro, and we are lagging behind. With regards to the measures that the Fed has already undergone more than 1 year ago. So we are lagging behind at least 1 year to what the Fed to the policies that the Fed has undergone by rising interest slowly and coming back to a normalization of monetary policy. We are far away from the normalization as we libertarians, as pro-market people would call it. We are far away from the use of sound money as we call it and claim it, but we are slowly going back to hopefully to normal by reducing the balance sheets of the central banks. Both the Fed and the ECB are reducing, but it's hard to come back. So right now we've started raising interest in Europe. As of last June, for the first time, we have from minus 0.5, we are now at 3% almost, taking steps up eventually gradually. But the issue is when money has no price, and what is the interest is the price of money, then it's worth next to nothing. And we end up in the issues that Roberto has just mentioned with Argentina. There is just too much money printing around to protect. After the grand financial crisis, we had the APP program that was running in Europe, which was the 3.7 billion right now that we have built in collaterals and debt. Plus, and this is the issue that we've seen and why COVID, for example, was so dangerous for not only Europe, but also the rest of the world. We within this COVID time, the 2 years, we've built another 1.7 trillion of pandemic emergency programs just in Europe. And this is an amount of money that is, tremendous. And, this is just vanishing, and it's given also by the politicians to their clientele to be reelected. After all, Jim Buchanan told us with public choice, you give in order to be reelected, and this is the big issue these days.
Barbara, let me butt in there just for a minute. You have hit on one of the key things that the revenge of power. You were mentioning that earlier, Roberto, and the guy who wrote that book, and also the Dictator's Handbook, and that is that autocrats want to have a small group of people around them that they can bestow favors on and give money to and continue so that they can stay in power. Now, I'm going to take you out of the monetary thing for a minute and move you over a bit from Austria, a little further east, and ask you to talk about one of our favorite autocrats, dictators, authoritarians, president of Russia, Mr. Putin, and let you tell us what you think is happening there. And of course, a little bit about the problems that were going on in Ukraine that led to this, and do that in 2 minutes, Barbara. How about that?
Well, it's a little bit more complex, but I tried to be very fast. Well, first of all, the aggression war against Ukraine is something that truly needs to be condemned, and that was a huge mistake. And Europe and the West does everything to help Ukraine to somehow survive and go, well, at least make sure that this war is not endless. This is our big hope in Europe. But it is not as easy as that, unfortunately. From a monetary front, Putin is... Well, he has his gold reserves. He has done, the Nabulina has done the right things to protect Russia on the one hand, which is... was not foreseeable for the West. And on the other hand, you have Ukraine struggling and receiving a lot of international support and help, whether it's IMF, World Bank, Europe, US. I think everybody is on their side to help. So it has to be seen that this solution, this terrible war, is over rather tomorrow than the next day. So this is, I think, our big goal. And having said that, the consequences of rebuilding Ukraine will have to be borne by the West. So whether it's the United States of America and Europe together, and we will definitely support this country to make sure to come back to democracy and make sure that their prior issues with oligarchs and with cronyism are over in this country. And there is hope, because there are many young, good groups, young people there who really want to build this country back to where it can be.
And you know that, Barbara, because you've been there and you know some of those people. Now, let's talk a little bit about solutions in the time that we have left. And Roberto, I'll ask you, we're concerned about, let's just say, democracies who have elected leaders who've gone to the autocratic side. There have been some success stories. Some people would say a couple of countries in your area, Bolivia, Ecuador, etc. How is it that countries are able to push back on this kind of authoritarianism and be somewhat successful in your estimation?
Well, unfortunately, those two countries that you mentioned, Dennis, are now seeing all kinds of challenges. There was an attempt, there was a citizens' response in Bolivia that took Evo Morales, a would-be Maduro dictator, out of power. But Morales' people have already returned, and they learned the lessons of how they should sustain power, and they're back. And unfortunately, Bolivia is on the verge of becoming sort of a full-fledged a fourth Cuba, so to speak. You know, you have Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and now Bolivia is just on the cusp of becoming a full-fledged autocracy in that regard. And Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso there was voted through democratic means. He became very popular because he learned how to use TikTok. Actually, that's what led him into power. As a former banker with a very clear focus of what needs to be done in Ecuador, knows that Ecuador can be a major player in global trade, for instance. So he's all about opening borders on all fronts, north, south, west, and east. The great Ecuadorian reform that has enabled the country to sustain itself is actually dollarization. Their currency was so worthless that they actually imported the dollar as the unit of account. And other autocrats have tried to de-dollarize, but the citizens respond and say, no, you can do anything, but don't touch my patrimony. Don't touch my currency. And that leads you to the idea that in economic reform, this is my personal opinion, but stability is the number one priority. Everything else is very important, but it has to come after you stabilize the unit of account and your measure of economic well-being. Now, as far as instead of just focusing on countries, let's also focus on the type of policies that are important. Mexico, with all the talk about kleptocracy and their narco state and whatnot, is a great success story from the vantage point of what is global trade and the opening of borders to global trade. There's some wonderful positive examples that have come to the fore from Mexico: investment in aerospace and auto parts and automobile industry, the integration of supply chains, some remarkable innovations and entrepreneurial disruptions that have emerged from Mexico. Brazil is another example. Despite its protectionism, you have probably it's the number one country in Latin America with the greatest amount of unicorns. Despite its vast bureaucracy and despite the incredibly inefficient rule of law that they have, they're able to get ahead in that regard. And I think those success stories tell us something about the entrepreneurial spirit in Latin America, and I would venture to say the entire world as well, which is that if a politician someday concentrates on simple rules for a complex world, who is going to be opposed to that? Make my life simple. We have a project at Atlas called the Index of Bureaucracy, which measures the time tax of bureaucratic burdens on microenterprises. Barbara, wouldn't you say that what a microenterprise, whether you're a Maoist or an anarchist or a libertarian, what you want is let me work.
Yeah.
Right?
And unchain the powers of entrepreneurial spirit. And this is what actually helps the most. And this is what all of us have been promoting over the last decades. And we've seen that countries that are freer, are more successful, where economic-wise are freer, are creating more economic growth, and by that raise people out of poverty. And that's a logic, that's a given, and this is what has happened across the world. And if we don't do that, if we reduce that, if we chain people again, if we put them in chains and don't allow them to be free and act economically as well, then we go down the drain. And this is what, in Europe, since you were talking about Latin America, but Europe actually has the 4 European freedoms in place. And we were just unable to literally use them again when COVID.
But Barbara, I love what you're saying. I understand all that. However, when I was teaching university, I had a lot of Chinese students. So I want you to address China. China has the ultimate authoritarian government, and yet billions of Chinese have done better economically in the last 30 years than other places around. So how do you explain that?
Well, if you come from zero, then you finally, or from below zero, then at least when you start having something, you're better off. And so they created growth and had growth rates from 7-10% over a couple of decades. And with COVID, they were cut down, but now they are back to 7% almost. And if you have this catch up process, of course, then it's good. But the question is, how much of direct foreign investment is being held privately? How much are you, as a direct foreign investor, as an entrepreneur, are allowed to do in this country? Where are the limits? And who owns the assets? And if it's the Communist Party in China, then it's this is very authoritarian, I would say.
Okay, all right,
whereas
Barbara, I hear you. I understand, and I agree with you. However, now, Roberto, China has made major inroads, not just in Africa, not just in Asia, not just palling around with Putin, but they've been investing significantly in your part of the world as well. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just to get Europe tied into Shanghai. I mean, it looks to me like that dictator is working with other dictators in South America. Am I missing something?
Well, no, you're not missing something, and it's a real wake-up call for the United States from the geopolitical standpoint. Now, that's not an area where I'm a full-fledged expert, so to speak, but I would say if free and voluntary investment from China or from wherever comes into Mexico and it abides by the rules of the game, let us say the rules that are stipulated in our free trade agreements that we have with over 47 countries in the world, then all the better. then all the better. If it's for geopolitical reasons in order to seize the day or in order to seize control of certain regions, especially in the border, that would be very important from a geopolitical standpoint to take a much closer look. I can't tell you that there seems to be more enthusiasm from Chinese investors today, not knowing whether they're public or private, which is a key question that Barbara brought up, than the United States, with all the talk about nearshoring and about now is the time to take integration, regional trade and investment integration in North America to the next level, and talk about infrastructure integration, and talk about having not one bridge between Tijuana and San Diego, but 100 bridges throughout the border that are much more secure than otherwise because they're governed by these so-called smart technologies. And the Chinese seem to be, Chinese investors seem to be one, if not two steps ahead of us in that regard.
Okay, now, Barbara, we just have about 5 minutes left. So we talk about these other countries. We have authoritarian problems in America. There's a lot of people who believe that our past president and perhaps future president, now indicted President Trump, is the epitome of this. And you didn't want to give up the election. It was a fraud, blah, 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 blah. So paint a little scenario for America ourselves here, if you don't mind.
Well, it would be arrogant as a European to give a statement on that front, and I absolutely will not do so. What we can do is what we have learned over history, what we have seen in Europe, that where we failed, and where we can just say where we have to warn the rest of the world. And I would just close by saying, we Europeans have outsourced our security to the US. We have outsourced our energy provision to Russia, and we have outsourced our production of cheap goods to China. So what is left for Europe? And this is a big question mark. And on the other hand, so if you look at the democracy spectrum, the US should ask themselves, and this is why I would not be as arrogant as to say something and give recommendations with regards to your former president or to the next president, because it's not up to me. But just be sure that the checks and balances are kept at bay, and that the democratic foundation that you have laid so greatly a couple of 100 years ago, and that Madison and Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers are constantly being looked at and asked. And with your constitution, I think you're much better off than we in many European countries.
Barbara, let me add a footnote to that, if possible, Dennis. What Barbara is saying reminds me of a famous saying by sociologist Daniel Bell, that he said that one of his patrons said, "Okay, I'm going to give you so much for your research project, but I want you to give me a prediction." And Daniel Bell was notoriously anti-prediction. You cannot predict the future because that's just an exercise in vanity. Fatal conceit, as Hayek would have said. He says, "But I'll give you this predictions just so you go home happy." He says, in the United States, this was in the year 2000, by the way. The United States, there's going to be elections this year, and somebody's going to win. And in the next 4 years, there's going to be elections, and somebody's going to win. And then so on and so forth, every 4 years, and somebody's going to win. He says, come on, that's not a prediction. He says, really? How many countries in the world can you say that? Even despite what happened in January of 2021, the United States still is an example of predictability in your institutions. And that's something that not that you should rest content with it, but it's something that why so many people and so many countries admire what the United States has done, and why we look back on the founding fathers, on Alexis de Tocqueville and his teachings, and on the institutional model of the United States.
Well, I appreciate that, and we certainly at least used to be the shining city on the hill. We have a media circus here in the U.S. We have polarization like we've never had before. We've done a lot of television programs on this subject. We haven't had anybody that has a good solution to that. But once you start the populist stuff and the polarization, and as we talked about, the post-truth, or in this case, propaganda, which Russians and Chinese are even better at than American politicians. And I hasten to say how bad that is. But what you guys are doing at the Austrian center that you run, Barbara, and at Atlas and the other places that you are involved in, Roberto, is key, because we know in this country that you cannot have the kind of republic that we established in 1787 without an intelligent and educated populace. And so the fact that you're here helping us, and in Europe and South America helping other people, is very, very important. What we want to stay away from is one of my favorite definitions of a type of government, and that's called a kakistocracy. Now, I'm sure the two of you know what a kakistocracy is, but for that viewer, let me read it to you. It's ruled by the stupid, a system of governance where the worst or least qualified citizens govern or dictate policy. Due to human nature being inherently flawed, it's been suggested that every government which has ever existed has been a prime example of kakistocracy. So I'm hoping that that's way too cynical, but from what I see from you folks, power begets power. These politicians want to stay in power. You've mentioned how they do it. And the fact that as long as they are in power, it seems to me that freedoms and liberty are lessened, as you have it mentioned, and to some extent, it may or may not be repairable. Now, I'm hoping that it is. Again, Barbara, take care of all the things you're doing. Get yourself back to Europe and solve their problems over there as soon as you can. And Roberto, back to Mexico and Latin America, doing the best you can. And here on this program, we have perspectives like yours because they matter. We have problems that matter, and we have power that needs to be limited. We always talk about perspectives that matter because we always talk about things that matter with people who care. Thank you, too, for being here, and thank you, our lovely viewer, for watching.